There is a city on 7 hills. It does not look like much at first. A handful of mud huts sitting above a marshy river. A few hundred people, maybe less, wrapped in animal skins against the cold of a central Italian winter. Goatherds, shepherds, people who argue about water rights and who gets to graze where. People who bury their dead on a hill they call the Palatine and believe, half seriously, that a wolf once nursed 2 boys on its slopes. That is where we begin. And then we move forward, slowly, through 8 centuries of the most improbable story in the history of human civilization. Because that cluster of huts, those few hundred people arguing about goats in the middle of Italy, will become something the world has never seen before and has never quite managed to produce again. They will build roads that still carry traffic. They will write laws that still govern courts. They will construct aqueducts so well engineered that engineers today look at them and feel quietly humbled. They will take a muddy, flood-prone, malarial riverbend and turn it into the capital of a civilization that stretches from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the rain-soaked highlands of Scotland. Nobody planned that. That is the most interesting thing about it. Nobody woke up one morning in 750 BC with a parchment that said, "Here is how we will conquer the known world in 8 steps." It grew, stumbled, collapsed, reformed, made catastrophic mistakes, survived things that should have ended it entirely, and kept going. It kept going because the Romans had one trait that is easy to underestimate and almost impossible to replicate. They were spectacularly good at learning from failure without being destroyed by pride. That is a harder thing than it sounds. Tonight we are going to walk through all of it. The founding, which is more complicated and more interesting than the myth. The kingdom that nobody much talks about, but that built the bones of everything that followed. The Republic, which was never quite as noble as the statues suggest, and never quite as corrupt as its enemies claimed. The social wars, and the blood that bought Roman citizenship for people who had died fighting for Rome for a century. The civil wars, Caesar, Augustus. The long, extraordinary peace that the world still calls by a Latin name. And then, at the end, the question that every civilization eventually has to face. What happens when the machine you built becomes too large for anyone to run? This is a long story. Settle in. And before we go any further, I want to say something quickly. Every night, thousands of people fall asleep listening to history. They put their phones down after 10 minutes, or they drift off somewhere in the middle of the Republic, and they wake up in the morning feeling genuinely rested in a way that is hard to explain. If that is you tonight, I am glad. That is exactly why I make these videos. There is something about a voice in the dark, moving slowly through a story that happened 2,000 years ago, that works better than silence and better than noise. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you have been here before, welcome back. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Now, let us go back to the beginning. The hills are older than the city. That is the first thing to understand. The Tiber River has been cutting through the soft volcanic rock of central Italy for millions of years. By the time any human being stood on those hills and looked down at the valley below, the landscape was already ancient in a way that would have been completely unintelligible to anyone standing there. The 7 hills of Rome are not natural wonders on the scale of mountains. They are low, rounded ridges, most of them between 40 and 50 meters above the valley floor. But in a landscape that was otherwise flat and marshy and dangerously prone to flooding, those ridges were the difference between life and death. They kept you above the water. They gave you a clear line of sight. They were defensible, and the river below was navigable. Wide enough for boats carrying salt from the coast, narrow enough to ford in a dry summer at certain points. The people who first settled those hills were not called Romans. They were not called anything in particular. They were Iron Age Latins, one of several Italic-speaking peoples scattered across central Italy in the centuries, before anyone started counting years in any systematic way. They herded cattle. They grew emmer, wheat, and barley. They buried their dead in urns. They made pottery that was functional and reasonably competent and had no particular pretensions to elegance. They were, in almost every observable respect, unremarkable. But they were on those hills. And those hills, it would turn out, were sitting at the crossroads of everything. To the north of the Tiber, the Etruscans were building something quite extraordinary. They had cities with proper streets and drainage systems. They had bronze working and sophisticated trade networks. They had a writing system they had borrowed and adapted from Greek colonists on the coast, and they were using it to write in a language so thoroughly different from anything else spoken in the region that modern scholars are still working out how it fits into the family of human languages. The Etruscans were, by the standards of central Italy in the 8th century BC, cosmopolitan. They knew about Greece, they knew about Carthage, they were comfortable talking to Phoenician traders and Egyptian merchants in a pidgin of gestures and Latin silver and promises about delivery dates. They were people of the world. To the south, Greek colonists had been setting up cities along the coastline for 100 years and more. They had brought with them the full toolkit of Greek civilization: architecture, philosophy, mathematics, a conception of civic life that was organized around the idea of the citizen rather than the subject, and wine, which the Latins and Etruscans both adopted with considerable enthusiasm. The Greeks called this region Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, and they meant it as a description of the coastline from the toe of Italy around to the base of the boot, studded with cities whose names you would recognize: Neapolis, which became Naples; Croton, which produced athletes who won in Olympia and philosophers who thought about numbers; Sybaris, which gave the world the word Sybaritic, because its people were said to live so luxuriously that their horses were trained to dance to music, which is either wonderful or troubling depending on your perspective. In between these two poles, in the central stretch of the Italian peninsula, the Latins sat and watched and traded and learned. And on those 7 hills above the Tiber, something was beginning to coalesce. The Romans told a story about their founding that was almost certainly not true in its details and was profoundly true in its spirit. Romulus and Remus, the story goes, were twin brothers, sons of the god Mars and a Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia. Their great-uncle, who had taken the throne of their grandfather's kingdom by force, ordered them drowned in the Tiber as infants, because the prophecy said they would one day reclaim what had been stolen. The servants tasked with drowning them could not bring themselves to do it, so they set the twins in a basket and let the river carry them. The river, being the Tiber and therefore sacred, carried them safely to the foot of the Palatine Hill, where a she-wolf found them and nursed them. A woodpecker brought them food. A shepherd named Faustulus found them eventually and raised them as his own. When they grew up, they killed their great-uncle, restored their grandfather to his throne, and then left to found a new city. The story does not explain everything, and it explains quite a lot. It explains the foundational Roman belief that they were blessed by the gods from the beginning, that their survival under pressure was not accidental, that there was something in the nature of Rome that made it hard to extinguish. It explains their comfort with mixed origins, because Romulus and Remus were the children of a god and a mortal woman, and were raised by a wolf and a farmer, which is not exactly a pure aristocratic lineage. It explains their relationship with violence, because the city was founded when Romulus killed Remus in a quarrel about who had the right to name it and rule it. The city of peace began in fratricide. The Romans thought about that fact for centuries and never quite stopped thinking about it. What actually happened, as best as historians and archaeologists can reconstruct, was considerably less dramatic and considerably more interesting. The area around the 7 hills was occupied by multiple small communities in the period between roughly 1000 and 700 BC. They were not unified. They spoke related but distinct dialects. They had their own burial customs, their own local gods, their own ideas about who owned what water and what grazing land. Gradually, over the course of the 8th century, these communities began to merge, not through conquest but through a process that scholars call synoikism, the joining together of households, the creation of a shared civic identity out of what had previously been separate villages. They began to share markets. They began to bury their dead in a common area rather than within their own settlements. They began to drain the marshy area between the hills that would become the Forum, which suggests a level of collective organization and shared labor that you cannot achieve without some kind of political structure, however rough and informal. This is not a story about a great man founding a city in a single dramatic moment. This is a story about communities slowly realizing that they were stronger together than apart, and choosing, imperfectly and sometimes violently, to become something new. The traditional founding date of Rome is 753 BC. The Romans themselves calculated this by working backward through their king lists and their records of magistrates, trying to pin the story of Romulus to a fixed point in time. Modern archaeology suggests the process was more gradual than a single founding date implies, but it also confirms that the period around the mid-8th century was genuinely significant. The archaeological record shows a real change in the organization of the settlements on the hills, a real increase in complexity, a real uptick in interaction with the wider Mediterranean world. Something was happening. Call it a founding if you like. Call it a coalescence. The point is that by the late 8th century, there was something on those 7 hills that was beginning to think of itself as a single thing, and it immediately ran into its first crisis. The crisis was simple. There were not enough women. Or rather, according to the tradition, the new community of Rome was heavily skewed toward men, because it had drawn in a lot of the rough and landless and dispossessed of the surrounding region, people who had no roots, no family connections, no wives. Romulus, the tradition says, sent to the neighboring peoples asking for marriage alliances, the standard diplomatic way of building kinship ties between communities. The neighbors refused. They did not want to give their daughters to this new, uncertain, structurally dubious experiment on the hills. So the Romans invited the Sabines to a festival and stole their women. The rape of the Sabine women, as it is known in the tradition, was probably not a single event. It was probably a compressed memory of the early period in which Rome absorbed neighboring peoples, sometimes by choice and sometimes by force, and in which the Sabines in particular became closely intertwined with the Roman community. The tradition itself recognizes something important about this. The Sabine women, having been taken and having married Roman men and having built lives there, intervene in the subsequent battle between their fathers and their husbands and demand that both sides stop. They choose neither. They choose Rome, the thing that is being made. They choose to be Romans. That is the spirit of the story. Rome was not built from a single people with a single origin. It was built from the mixing of peoples, the absorption of neighbors, the constant influx of the different and the foreign. The Sabines became Romans. So did the Etruscans. So did the Greeks. So did, eventually, everyone the Romans encountered, until the question of what a Roman was had to be answered, not by bloodline, but by law. That is the hinge on which everything else turns. The kings of Rome are the part of Roman history that receives the least attention and deserves considerably more. Most people know Caesar. Most people have heard of Augustus. If they know anything about the earlier period, they know the names of the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, and they know he was expelled and the Republic was founded, and they move on. But there were 7 kings before the Republic, and the 244 years of the kingdom were not a period of stagnation waiting for something interesting to happen. They were the period in which Rome built its physical and institutional skeleton. Romulus, the first king, is credited in the tradition with the founding of the legions, the division of the people into 3 tribes, the establishment of the Senate as a council of elders, and the creation of the institutions of augury, the reading of birds, which the Romans would maintain with total seriousness until the empire was already Christian and even somewhat after. Whether Romulus did any of these things specifically, or whether these inventions were the work of the period, compressed into the biography of a mythical founder, does not matter very much for our purposes. What matters is that by the end of the regal period, Rome had all of these things: a citizen army organized into legions, a senate, religious institutions for reading the will of the gods before any major action, and a complex system of tribal organization for political purposes. Numa Pompilius, the second king, was a Sabine, which tells you something important about the early mixing of peoples. He is credited with the establishment of the religious calendar, the organization of the priestly colleges, and the construction of the Temple of Janus, whose doors were closed only when Rome was at peace and open when Rome was at war. In later Roman history, those doors would stand open for centuries at a stretch, which gives you a sense of how often Rome was at peace. But Numa is remembered as the architect of Roman piety, the man who taught the Romans to take the gods seriously and to build the proper institutional apparatus for doing so. He reportedly learned everything he knew from sitting beside a sacred spring and receiving wisdom from a nymph named Egeria, which is either a beautiful story about the sources of wisdom or a very convenient way of explaining why a king had unusually good ideas. The later kings, Tullus Hostilius and Ancus Marcius, and the two Tarquins, brought war and expansion and the absorption of neighboring Latin peoples and, crucially, a massive Etruscan influence on what Rome was becoming. The Etruscans gave Rome its alphabet, adapted from Greek, which the Romans then adapted further and handed to most of Western Europe. They gave Rome the toga, the formal garment that became so synonymous with Roman dignity that the Emperor Augustus would eventually legislate that Romans had to wear it in public. They gave Rome the idea of the triumph, the spectacular victory parade through the city that would become one of the defining rituals of the Republic and the Empire. They gave Rome urban infrastructure on a scale that central Italy had never seen. The Cloaca Maxima, the great drain that channeled the water from the Forum into the Tiber, was built during the regal period under Etruscan influence, and it is still, structurally, operational. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, built the temple to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. He also, according to the tradition, was a tyrant in the technical Greek sense of the word, which did not originally mean someone cruel, but someone who had taken power by irregular means and governed without proper consultation of those who expected to be consulted. His son attacked a noblewoman named Lucretia. She told her father and husband what had happened and then killed herself, because in Roman terms, honor was something that could be violated bodily and had to be redeemed in blood. Her kinsman Lucius Junius Brutus used her death as a rallying point. The people expelled the Tarquins, the kings were gone, and in their place came the Republic. That was 509 BC by the Roman calculation. The Republic is the period that Rome itself looked back on with the most pride and the most anxiety. The Romans of the imperial period were constantly arguing about whether the Republic had been better, whether its values had been purer, whether the men of the Republic had been made of sterner stuff than the men of the Empire. Cicero wrote about the Republic as a lost golden age. Livy wrote about it as a long argument between virtue and temptation. Sallust wrote about it as a story of inevitable moral decline. They were all right and all wrong in different ways, which is probably true of most institutions that people find worth arguing about. The Republic's basic structure was a masterpiece of balanced anxiety. The Romans had expelled one king who had become a tyrant, and they were determined never to have another one. But they had also lived for 2.5 centuries under kings, and they understood that executive power was sometimes necessary, that someone had to be able to make quick decisions when the city was threatened. Their solution was to divide the royal power between 2 men, elected annually, called consuls, each of whom could veto the other. No single man could hold all the authority. No single man could use the emergency powers for more than 1 year without going back to the people and the Senate for renewal. No single man could do what Tarquin had done, because if he tried, his colleague would stop him. It was, in theory, beautiful. In practice, it worked for about 4 centuries, which by the standards of political systems is actually a remarkable run. Below the consuls, the Republic built out an elaborate structure of magistracies, praetors who handled legal matters and military commands, censors who maintained the roles of citizens and watched the public morality of senators, quaestors who managed the treasury, aediles who managed the city's infrastructure and public games, and the tribunes of the plebs, who were the single most interesting invention in the whole structure. The tribunes of the plebs require some context. The early republic was not, despite what the word republic might suggest, a democracy. It was an aristocracy with democratic elements, and the aristocracy in question was the patricians, the great families who claimed descent from the senators of the regal period, and who had inherited the lion's share of political power, religious authority, and good agricultural land along with it. The plebeians, everyone else, were citizens in theory, but largely excluded from power in practice. They could not marry patricians. They could not hold the major magistracies. They could not serve as priests. They were, in effect, citizens of a system that had been designed by and for someone else. This situation did not persist without resistance. The period from roughly 494 to 287 BC is called the Struggle of the Orders, and it was the long, grinding, occasionally violent process by which the plebeians extracted concessions from the patricians until they achieved something approaching genuine civic equality. They did it through a weapon that remains remarkable in the history of political action: the secession. In 494 BC, the plebeians walked out. They left the city and went to the Sacred Mount, a hill outside Rome, and they sat there. They were, in a very literal sense, on strike. They were the farmers who grew the food. They were the craftsmen who made the weapons. They were the soldiers who fought in the legions. Without them, the patrician city of Rome could not function. The patricians, faced with the prospect of a city that could not feed itself or defend itself, negotiated. The result was the creation of the tribunes of the plebes, magistrates who were sacrosanct, whose person was inviolable, who could interpose themselves between any Roman citizen and any act of arbitrary executive power, and who could veto any law or action they deemed harmful to the people. The Romans called this power the tribunicia potestas, the tribunician power, and they were so attached to it as a concept that Augustus, when he was constructing the empire and needed to figure out how to give himself permanent emergency authority without calling himself a king, reached for this power. He held tribunician power for the rest of his life. The emperors after him did the same. The weapon the plebs had invented to protect themselves from aristocratic overreach became the constitutional foundation of the most powerful one-man government the Western world had seen. History finds interesting uses for things. The struggle of the orders also produced something that the world still uses: the 12 tables. In 451 BC, under pressure from the plebs, who were tired of having the law administered arbitrarily by patrician magistrates who knew the unwritten rules and could apply them selectively, Rome sent a commission to study Greek law and then produced a written legal code. The 12 tables were not a sophisticated document by the standards of later Roman law. They were rough and sometimes brutal. A debtor who could not pay could be cut into pieces and distributed among his creditors, a provision that was apparently theoretical even in 451 BC. But that tells you something about the cultural climate. But they were written, they were public, they were the same for everyone, or at least that was the aspiration, and the aspiration was the thing that mattered. Written law is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the most powerful inventions in human political history. Unwritten law is always the law of whoever is powerful enough to remember it their way. Written law is imperfect and manipulable and subject to reinterpretation, but it is there. You can argue about what it says. You can appeal to it. You can demand that someone explain exactly where in the written text the authority for a particular action is to be found. The 12 tables gave the Roman plebs the ability to do that, and Rome never went back to unwritten law again. The early republic was not a period of quiet internal development. It was a period of constant, brutal war. Rome's immediate neighbors were not interested in allowing a city-state on 7 hills to grow in peace. The Sabines were a persistent threat. The Volsci and the Aequi, Latin peoples to the south and east, raided Roman territory regularly. The Etruscans to the north were a complex mix of trading partners and potential enemies. The city of Veii, just 12 miles from Rome across the Tiber, was an Etruscan city that contested with Rome for the same good agricultural land and the same river crossings and the same salt routes from the coast. Rome and Veii fought 3 wars over the course of the 5th century, with the third and final one ending in 396 BC, when a Roman army besieged Veii for 10 years, a feat so extraordinary that the Romans compared it to Troy and then tunneled under its walls and took the city. The sack of Veii was Rome's first great triumph. It was followed, almost immediately, by Rome's first great catastrophe. The Gauls came from the north. Celtic peoples had been moving through the Alpine passes into the Po Valley of northern Italy for generations, and by the early 4th century BC, they had pushed the Etruscan cities of the north sufficiently far back that they had the run of the peninsula above the Apennines. In 387 BC, a Gallic army under a chieftain named Brennus moved south. The Romans met them at the Tiber River. The battle was a disaster. Roman discipline, which had proved sufficient for the opponents they had faced so far, was no match for the Celtic charge. The legions broke. The survivors fled back to Rome. Most of the city's population evacuated. The senators, the old men, the priests carrying the sacred objects, the elderly too frail to walk. Some of them stayed. According to the tradition, they dressed in their senatorial robes and sat in their ivory chairs in the forum as the Gauls entered the city, so still and so dignified that the Gauls initially thought they were statues. One Gaul reached out and stroked the beard of a senator named Marcus Papirius. Papirius hit him with his ivory staff. The Gauls killed all the senators in the forum that day. The Gauls held Rome for 7 months. They burned much of it. They demanded a ransom in gold. The Romans, who had taken refuge on the Capitoline Hill, which was defended by its walls and apparently saved by a sacred flock of geese that made enough noise to wake the garrison during a night attack, paid the ransom. When the Gallic chieftain added extra weights to the scales, a Roman officer named Camillus appeared, according to the tradition, with his army, threw his sword onto the scales, and said the famous words, "Woe to the vanquished." The Gauls left. Camillus became the second founder of Rome. Whether the story is exactly true matters less than what the Romans took from it. They took a burning lesson about the cost of military failure. They took a commitment to rebuilding that was so thorough and so rapid that the new Rome, built on the ashes of the old one, was a denser and more urban city than what had stood before. And they built a wall, the so-called Servian Wall, which enclosed a larger area than any previous fortification. Built from the volcanic stone called tufa that the quarries outside the city provided in abundance. The wall is still partially visible today. You can see sections of it near the main railway station in Rome, blocks of stone laid with a precision that suggests the Romans were already, in the 4th century BC, thinking about permanence in a way that most of their contemporaries were not. The Gallic sack broke something in the early Roman confidence and put something harder in its place. Before the Gauls, Rome was a regional power with ambitions. After the Gauls, Rome became a city that remembered what it felt like to lose everything and had decided, collectively and with great intensity, that it would never feel that way again. That decision shaped everything that followed. The 4th and 3rd centuries BC were the period in which Rome conquered Italy, not in a single campaign, not through a single great strategy. It happened the way Roman power almost always grew, through a combination of war, alliance, and the systematic incorporation of defeated enemies into the Roman structure. The Romans had a formula for this that they applied with remarkable consistency. Defeat your enemy, then offer them the choice of a formal alliance with Rome, with obligations to provide soldiers for Roman wars and to follow Roman foreign policy, but with the retention of their own laws, their own magistrates, their own local customs and languages and religious practices. Join us or face further war. Join us, and you may keep almost everything except complete independence. Most people took the deal. The Latin League was dissolved in 338 BC after a Latin revolt, and the Latin cities were given different grades of Roman or near-Roman status, depending on their behaviour and their strategic importance. The Campanians in the south, who had asked for Roman protection against the Samnites, found themselves drawn into the Roman orbit. The Samnites themselves, a fiercely independent mountain people who controlled the central Apennines, fought Rome in 3 great wars between 343 and 290 BC. The Samnite Wars are not well known outside of specialist historical circles, but they were, by the standards of the ancient world, major conflicts. The Romans lost badly enough in the Second Samnite War that a Roman army was forced to walk under the Caudine Forks, a humiliating ritual of submission that was the ancient equivalent of unconditional surrender. They came back. They always came back. The Samnites were eventually defeated not because they lacked courage or because their army was inferior, but because they could not match Roman persistence and Roman resources. Every time the Samnites won a battle, they won a battle. Every time Rome lost a battle, it rebuilt, recruited, and tried again. The Romans had this understanding. A defeat is a lesson, not a verdict. The Samnites did not have the luxury of the same belief, because they were a looser confederation without Rome's institutional memory for recovering from disaster. By 270 BC, with the Greek cities of the south also brought into the Roman alliance system, Rome controlled everything south of the Po Valley. It controlled a diverse, multilingual, multi-ethnic peninsula of peoples who spoke Oscan and Umbrian and Greek and Etruscan and half a dozen other languages, who worshipped different gods with different rites, who had different legal traditions and different agricultural customs and different ideas about what proper clothing looked like. Rome had made all of them Roman in some degree, and the genius of the arrangement was that being Roman did not require you to stop being what you already were. You could be an Oscan-speaking farmer in Samnium, who also happened to have Latin rights and who sent his sons to serve in the legions. You could be a Greek merchant in Naples, who had Roman citizenship and used it to navigate the legal system while continuing to speak Greek at home and sacrifice to Hermes on his appropriate feast days. The empire did not begin when Augustus took power. It began when Rome decided that its identity was a legal status rather than an ethnic origin. That decision, made gradually and pragmatically over the course of the 4th and 3rd centuries, is the decision that made everything else possible. The Punic Wars deserve more than we have time for tonight, and I will give them what I can. Carthage was the other great power of the Western Mediterranean. Founded by Phoenician colonists on the North African coast in roughly 814 BC, according to the Roman tradition, it had grown into a mercantile empire that dominated the trade routes of the Western Sea. The Carthaginians controlled Spain. They controlled Sardinia. They controlled much of Sicily. They had a navy that was, by any objective measure, better than anything Rome could field. They were wealthy beyond Roman experience. They were organized, disciplined, and had access to resources in Africa that made their army and their treasury formidable. Rome and Carthage had coexisted as distant powers for generations. The Tiber and the Tunisian coast are not exactly neighbors, but when Rome's expansion brought it to the toe of Italy, and it began looking across the narrow strait of water between Italy and Sicily, and Carthage looked back across the same water, a collision became almost inevitable. Sicily was too important, too strategically located, too agriculturally productive, too symbolically significant, for both powers to share without friction. The First Punic War, from 264 to 241 BC, was primarily a naval war in which Rome did something extraordinary. It built a fleet from scratch. The Romans had no meaningful naval tradition. They were a land power. They looked at Carthaginian ships, built copies, trained their crews in a contraption set up on dry land to simulate the motion of rowing, and within years were fighting the Carthaginians at sea. They lost catastrophically multiple times to storms, as much as to enemy action. They built new fleets. They lost again. They built again. At the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BC, the Roman fleet won a decisive victory that ended the war and gave Rome control of Sicily. Carthage accepted the loss and paid the indemnity and went back to Spain, where a general named Hamilcar Barca and later his son-in-law Hasdrubal and then his son Hannibal built a new Carthaginian empire. Hannibal grew up hating Rome with a specific, focused, intense hatred that he had, according to the tradition, sworn to his father as a child. He spent his adult life preparing to act on it. In 218 BC, Hannibal took his army, including his famous war elephants, out of Spain and marched it through southern Gaul and then across the Alps in the late autumn. The crossing of the Alps alone cost him half his army to cold and altitude and ambushes by mountain tribes. He arrived in Italy with perhaps 26,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, having started with nearly 90,000. He was outnumbered, and his army was exhausted, and his elephants, most of whom would die in the first Italian winter, were already weakened. And then he proceeded to inflict on Rome 3 of the most devastating defeats in the history of ancient warfare. At the Tiber River, in December 218, he destroyed a Roman army by using his cavalry to envelop them from both sides. At Lake Trasimene in June 217, he ambushed another Roman army in a morning fog on the lakeshore and killed perhaps 15,000 men in 3 hours. At Cannae in August 216, he faced a Roman army that outnumbered his significantly and destroyed it so completely that the field afterward was covered with perhaps 70,000 Roman dead. He had used his infantry to allow themselves to be pushed back in the center, while his cavalry drove around the flanks and closed the trap behind the Romans. It is studied in military academies to this day. After Cannae, the allied cities of southern Italy began to defect to Hannibal. Capua, the second city of Italy, went over. The road to Rome seemed open. Hannibal did not march on Rome. This is one of the great what-ifs of history. His cavalry commander, Mahabal, is said to have told him, "You know how to win a victory, but not how to use one." Historians have been arguing about why Hannibal did not march on Rome since antiquity. He may have lacked the siege equipment. He may have been waiting for reinforcements from Carthage that never came. He may have thought that the further defection of Italian allies would do his work for him without the risk of a failed siege of the greatest city in Italy. Whatever the reason, he did not march. He campaigned in southern Italy for 16 more years, winning battles and winning nothing else. Rome, in the meantime, did what Rome always did after catastrophic defeat. It rebuilt. It appointed a dictator named Quintus Fabius Maximus, who earned the nickname Cunctator, the Delayer, for his strategy of refusing to meet Hannibal in open battle and instead following him, cutting off foraging parties, harassing supply lines, wearing him down. It raised new armies. It kept the loyalty of the great majority of its Italian allies, who understood that if Hannibal won, the arrangements that had given them their status would dissolve into something unknown. It sent armies to Spain to cut off Hannibal's base of supply, and eventually it produced Publius Cornelius Scipio, who went to Spain, then to Africa, defeated Carthage's African allies, forced Hannibal to abandon Italy and return to defend Carthage, and at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, using tactics derived from studying Hannibal himself, destroyed the Carthaginian army. The Second Punic War ended with Carthage stripped of its empire, prohibited from making war without Rome's permission, and reduced to a client state. The Third Punic War, 50 years later, ended with Carthage destroyed, its population sold into slavery, and its site cursed. The Romans did not salt the earth, that is a later legend, but they did make very sure that nothing would rise from those ruins to threaten them again. The destruction of Carthage left Rome the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. The conquest of Macedonia and the breaking of the Seleucid Empire in the east did the same for the Eastern Mediterranean. By 146 BC, the year Carthage was destroyed and Corinth was sacked, Rome was the unchallenged master of the entire Mediterranean world, which it would soon begin to call Mare Nostrum, RC. But the conquests had consequences that the people who prosecuted them had not anticipated and were not prepared for. The wealth that poured into Rome from Spain and Greece and Africa and Asia was vast. It flowed primarily to the men who had been in a position to profit from the wars. The great families who provided the generals, the merchants who followed the armies, the investors who bought up the contracts to collect taxes in the provinces. It did not flow, in any proportionate way, to the small farmers of Italy who had provided the bulk of the soldiers. The small farmers had a particular problem. They had served in the legions for years at a stretch. During those years, their farms had not been managed, because the men who would have managed them were in Spain or Macedonia or Africa fighting for Rome. When they came home, the farms were run down. The land needed investment they did not have. And in the meantime, the large landowners, the wealthy families who had not been fighting personally, had been expanding their holdings, using slave labor from the conquests to work land on a scale that the small free farmer could not compete with. The result was a demographic catastrophe for the Italian countryside. Small farms were absorbed into large estates. Their former owners drifted to Rome and other cities, where they joined the urban poor. The census of Roman citizens, which was the measure of the property-owning citizens who could serve in the legions, began to decline. This was not just a social problem, it was a military problem. The legions required property-owning citizens who could afford their own equipment. As the pool of such men shrank, the pool of available soldiers shrank. Rome was conquering more territory than it could defend, with the army it could recruit. A man named Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus looked at this situation and saw it clearly and decided to do something about it. In 133 BC, as tribune of the plebs, he proposed a land reform. Enforce an old law that limited the amount of public land any individual could hold. Redistribute the excess to the landless poor. Give the small farmers a new foundation. It was not a radical proposal, in principle. The law he was trying to enforce had been on the books for generations, simply ignored. But it directly threatened the wealth of the large landowners, many of whom were senators, and the Senate had spent those generations ignoring the law for a reason. The Senate arranged for another tribune to veto the proposal. Tiberius Gracchus, in an unprecedented act, had the assembly vote that tribune out of office, then push through his reform. He was pushing the constitution in ways the constitution had not been designed to accommodate. When he stood for re-election as tribune, his enemies in the Senate organized a mob. They killed him in the forum with chair legs. 300 of his supporters died with him. The first great political murder of the Republic. It would not be the last. His younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, took up the cause a decade later with a broader program that included grain subsidies for the urban poor, new road construction to provide employment, and a proposal to extend Roman citizenship to the Italian allies. He was cornered on the Aventine Hill with his supporters in 121 BC. He died either by suicide or at the hands of his pursuers. The Senate declared an emergency and killed 3,000 of his supporters without trial. The Gracchi are names that have echoed through every subsequent discussion of social reform and political violence. The Romans themselves could not agree on whether they were heroes or demagogues, whether they had been murdered or justly removed, whether their deaths were a tragedy or a necessary defense of order. The debate continued for the rest of the Republic. It has not entirely stopped. What the deaths of the Gracchi demonstrated was that the constitutional machinery of the Republic, which had been designed to balance aristocratic and popular power, was no longer adequate to the scale of Rome's social problems. The Senate had used violence to stop legislative reform. That precedent, once established, could not be unestablished. The question of how to reform Rome without being killed for attempting it, or how to stop reform without becoming the person who killed reformers, was now the central question of Roman political life. It would take 150 more years to answer, and the answer would be, you cannot do either. You can only keep fighting until one side wins entirely. The century between the Gracchi and Julius Caesar is one of the most crowded and consequential periods in the history of the ancient world. It contains the social war, in which Rome's Italian allies finally took up arms to demand the citizenship that had been denied them for generations. It contains the dictatorship of Sulla, who used his legions to march on Rome itself, a thing that no Roman general had ever done before, and who killed enough of his enemies that their severed heads decorated the speaker's platform in the forum. It contains the slave revolt of Spartacus, who led an army of perhaps 100,000 escaped slaves that held the southern Italian countryside for 2 years before being destroyed by Crassus, whose celebration of victory involved crucifying 6,000 prisoners along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome. It contains the extraordinary career of Pompey, who cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in 3 months with a naval campaign of such organizational efficiency that it still commands respect, and who then turned east and in the space of a few years reorganized the entire eastern Mediterranean, making client kingdoms and settling territorial disputes and founding cities with the casual authority of a man who understood that he had the power of Rome behind him and was not shy about using it. And then there is Julius Caesar. Gaius Julius Caesar was born in 100 BC into a patrician family of good lineage and limited means. His family claimed descent from Venus through Aeneas, which was an impressive ancestry for recruiting popular support and not much help with the rent. He was politically gifted from a young age, which in the Rome of his era meant knowing when to be bold and when to be cautious, which factions to cultivate and which to antagonize, how to build the popular following that could be a source of protection and advancement, and how to manage money in a city where money was the blood of politics. He served as a junior magistrate, as a priest, as a military commander in Spain, where he reportedly wept at a statue of Alexander the Great because Alexander had conquered the world at the age at which Caesar had accomplished nothing particularly remarkable. He built alliances with Pompey and Crassus, the two most powerful men in Rome, and the three of them formed what modern historians call the First Triumvirate, a private political arrangement in which they agreed to use their combined power and influence to support each other's ambitions. Caesar used this arrangement to get himself appointed governor of Gaul, which had been in Roman hands in its southern strip, but was mostly unconquered beyond that. Then he conquered it. The Gallic Wars, from 58 to 50 BC, were a masterpiece of military improvisation. Caesar arrived in Gaul with 4 legions and a mandate to defend the Roman province from migration and raids. He left with 8 legions and an entire new province. He had fought dozens of major engagements, built bridges across the Rhine in 10 days to demonstrate Roman power to the Germanic tribes, crossed to Britain twice because he was curious about what was there and found it less interesting than he had hoped, and reduced the population of Gaul by such a combination of slaughter and enslavement that Plutarch later estimated that 1 million Gauls had been killed and another 1 million enslaved, numbers that are almost certainly inflated, but that point toward a reality of extraordinary violence. The Gallic Wars made Caesar 3 things: an experienced general, commanding devoted and battle-hardened legions, a man of enormous personal wealth from the sale of slaves and the plunder of temples, and a hero of the Roman popular tradition. They also put him in direct conflict with the Senate, which had concluded, correctly, that Caesar was becoming too powerful to accommodate within the existing constitutional structure, and with Pompey, whose political alliance with Caesar had dissolved as their interests diverged, and as it became clear that there was not room in the Roman world for 2 men of their respective ambitions. In January of 49 BC, the Senate ordered Caesar to disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen to face charges of treason and illegal conduct in Gaul. Caesar knew what those charges meant. A Roman general who gave up his legions was a private citizen. A private citizen could be prosecuted and exiled and destroyed. The legal protection of imperium, the military authority of a commander, was the only thing standing between Caesar and his enemies. He took his army to the Rubicon River, the boundary between the Roman province and Italy proper, and he stopped. The tradition says he hesitated for a long time on the bank of that small river. He knew what crossing it meant. No Roman general was permitted to bring an armed force into Italy. It was one of the most fundamental laws of the Republic, put in place precisely to prevent the army from becoming an instrument of domestic politics. To cross the Rubicon with his legions was to declare civil war against the Roman state. He crossed. The phrase has entered the language. To cross the Rubicon means to pass the point of no return, to commit to a course of action from which there is no comfortable withdrawal. Caesar crossed the Rubicon on the night of January 10, or possibly 11, 49 BC, and the Republic, already badly damaged, began its final bleeding. Pompey, commanding the senatorial forces, withdrew from Italy to Greece to gather his strength. Caesar swept through Italy in weeks, so fast that the towns and cities opened their gates before his army arrived. He followed Pompey to Greece. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered at Dyrrhachium, where his fortification lines were breached and his army nearly destroyed. He retreated. He rebuilt. At Pharsalus, in August 48 BC, he faced Pompey's larger army and destroyed it. Pompey fled to Egypt. He was killed on the beach by Egyptian officials who thought they were doing Caesar a favor. Caesar arrived in Egypt days later, was presented with Pompey's head in a basket, and wept. Whether the weeping was genuine is a question for psychologists. The political effect was that Caesar now appeared gracious in victory, which was useful. In Egypt, he met Cleopatra, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, who was in the middle of a civil war with her brother. He installed her as queen. He spent several months in Egypt, and a child named Caesarion was born afterward, who may or may not have been his. He then fought campaigns in Asia Minor, where he sent his famous dispatch, Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. 3 words. The campaign had lasted 4 days. He returned to Rome. He was appointed dictator, a legal office in the Roman constitution that granted temporary emergency powers, but he was appointed dictator with no specified time limit, and eventually he was appointed dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. He wore a purple robe. He sat on a gilded chair. His face was on the coins. His statue stood in the temples alongside the gods. He was, in everything but name and formal designation, a king. And the Romans had expelled their last king 5 centuries before, and built an entire civilization around the hatred of the very idea. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, a group of senators, who called themselves liberators, killed him at the base of a statue of Pompey in the Senate House, 23 stab wounds. He fell at the feet of his dead enemy's statue and pulled his toga over his face as he died. The death of Caesar solved nothing. It opened another round of civil war that lasted 13 more years. Marcus Antonius and Caesar's adopted heir Octavian fought the liberators and defeated them at Philippi. Then Antony and Octavian divided the Roman world between them. Then they fought each other. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian's fleet defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Antony killed himself in Alexandria, believing, incorrectly, that Cleopatra was already dead. Cleopatra killed herself after being told she would be paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph. Caesarion, the son of Caesar and Cleopatra, and therefore a possible rival, was quietly killed. Octavian returned to Rome, the undisputed master of the world. What Octavian did next is perhaps the most extraordinary act of political genius in the history of the ancient world. He did not call himself king. He did not call himself dictator, a word that Caesar's death had made toxic. He carefully dismantled the emergency powers he had accumulated during the civil wars and returned them to the Senate, keeping only what could be justified in traditional republican terms. The Senate, grateful and somewhat stunned, gave him the name Augustus, the revered one, a title that had religious overtones and suggested the sacred quality of a man blessed by the gods. He held tribunician power, protecting him from prosecution and giving him the veto. He held the proconsular power of a provincial governor over the provinces where the legions were stationed, which meant he controlled the army. He was the first citizen, the princeps, from which we get the word prince. He was not the king. The republic was restored. Everyone understood that it was a polite fiction, and everyone was exhausted and grateful enough to maintain it. What followed was called the Principate, the period of the first citizens, and it lasted in its classical form through the first 2 centuries AD. It brought the Roman world something it had not known for over a century: peace. Not complete peace, never that. The legions still fought on the frontiers. German tribes still raided. The Parthians still contested the eastern borderlands. But within the borders of the empire, the peace was as complete as anything the ancient world had managed. The roads were safe. The sea lanes were safe. Trade moved from Britain to Mesopotamia along a network of roads and harbours maintained by Roman engineers and protected by Roman law. Cities grew. Populations increased. Architecture reached scales that had been previously impossible. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, lasted, with interruptions, for roughly 200 years. During those 200 years, the population of the empire may have been as high as 70 million people. The empire stretched from Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the Euphrates River in what is now Iraq, from the Rhine and Danube in Central Europe to the Sahara Desert in North Africa. It was the largest political unit that the Mediterranean world had ever seen, and it was held together by roads, by law, by the Latin language in the west and Greek in the east, and by the army. The army was, in the end, what everything depended on. Augustus had settled the question of how to control it by making the legions loyal to the emperor personally through a system of pay and bonuses and benefits that the emperor controlled, culminating in a discharge payment at the end of 25 years of service that gave a retired veteran the economic foundation for a reasonably comfortable old age. The legions were loyal to whoever paid them. Augustus made sure that the person who paid them was himself. His successors discovered the implications of this arrangement with varying degrees of alarm. The emperors after Augustus are the part of Roman history that draws the most fascinated horror, and some of that fascination is deserved, and some of it is the product of ancient gossip, elevated by remarkable writers to the status of history. Tiberius, who succeeded Augustus, was a capable administrator and a genuinely competent general who became increasingly paranoid and withdrawn, spending his later years on the island of Capri and allowing the Praetorian prefect Sejanus to effectively run the empire for several years before having him arrested and executed in a session of the Senate that Tiberius attended by proxy. Through a letter, he died unloved, widely suspected of perversion, and the historian Suetonius filled many pages with accusations that historians have been arguing about ever since. Caligula succeeded him and lasted 4 years before being assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. The sources describe him as a monster of cruelty and madness, but the sources were written by senators who despised him, and the truth about any Roman emperor is always at least partly filtered through the perspective of the class that wrote about them and suffered the most from their displeasure. Claudius, who the Praetorian Guard dragged out from behind a curtain and proclaimed emperor because they needed someone and he was there, turned out to be a serious and scholarly man who expanded the empire to include Britain, built an excellent harbour at Ostia, and was poisoned by his wife, probably, with a dish of mushrooms. Nero burned Rome, or rather Rome burned, during his reign, in the Great Fire of 64 AD, and he was accused of having started it to make room for his enormous palace complex, which accusation is almost certainly false, but is comprehensible given the palace he built afterward. He persecuted the Christians, who were a new and strange sect from Judea, who refused to make the customary sacrifices to the gods, and who therefore appeared to Roman administrators as people who were refusing to perform the civic duty of religious observance. He killed his mother and possibly his wife. He styled himself an artist and a performer, which the Romans considered completely undignified for an emperor, and he died during a revolt by provincial governors, a suicide, reportedly saying, "What an artist dies in me." Then there was a year with 4 emperors, a period of such rapid succession that it suggested the fundamental instability at the heart of the Augustan settlement. The army, not the constitution, determined who ruled. The Flavian dynasty produced Vespasian, who stabilized things and began the Colosseum, and Titus, who destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, and whose triumph in Rome included the carrying through the streets of the menorah from the temple, and Domitian, who was assassinated by a conspiracy that included his wife and members of the Praetorian Guard. And then, the period that Edward Gibbon called the era of the human race's greatest happiness, the 5 good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 96 to 180 AD, and who each, with the exception of Marcus Aurelius, adopted and trained their successor rather than passing power to a biological son. Each was chosen for competence rather than birth, and each was, by the standards of the evidence, a genuinely competent ruler. Trajan conquered Dacia, which is modern Romania, and fought 2 successful campaigns against the Parthians. Hadrian consolidated the frontiers, built the wall in Britain that still bears his name, travelled obsessively to every corner of the empire, and fell in love with a Greek youth named Antinous, who drowned in the Nile in 130 AD, and whom Hadrian then had deified, which the Romans found mildly embarrassing. Antoninus Pius ruled for 23 years without leaving Italy, and was so mild and effective that he was called Pius, the Pious, and is the emperor about whom there is least to say, because nothing went wrong. Marcus Aurelius was the philosopher emperor, a genuine Stoic who wrote his personal meditations in Greek and is still read by people looking for guidance on how to live, and who spent most of his reign fighting German tribes on the Danube frontier, because the German tribes were not interested in the Stoic meditations and were very interested in what was on the other side of the river. Marcus Aurelius made the mistake of having a biological son, and that son was Commodus, who believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules and appeared in the arena to kill animals with his own hands, and whose assassination in 192 AD opened the period of instability that the 3rd century would deliver. The 3rd century is the period that historians call the crisis, and it was. Between 235 and 285 AD, the empire went through 50 years of near constant civil war, invasion, plague, economic collapse, and the fragmentation of the empire into 3 pieces that briefly governed themselves independently. There were 26 emperors in those 50 years, plus an uncounted number of claimants and usurpers. Most of them were military men of provincial origin who were elevated by their legions and killed by their legions when they failed to deliver victories or pay. The average reign was about 2 years. Several lasted weeks. The causes were structural as much as personal. The army had always been the real source of imperial power, but in the 2nd century, the fiction of civilian authority was maintained. In the 3rd century, the fiction dissolved. Emperors, raised from the provincial armies, had no loyalty to the old senatorial families, no interest in maintaining the elaborate constitutional theatre of the Principate, and no base of legitimacy except the sword. When the sword failed, they fell. The Germanic tribes on the Rhine and Danube took advantage of the instability to raid deep into Italy and the Balkans. The Sassanid Persian Empire, which had replaced the Parthians in 224 AD and was considerably more aggressive, raided across the eastern frontier and in 260 AD captured the Emperor Valerian in battle, the first Roman emperor to be taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. He apparently died in captivity. Plague also struck, repeatedly, the Antonine Plague of the 160s and 170s, and the Plague of Cyprian in the 250s and 260s, killing significant fractions of the population and disrupting the agricultural and administrative systems that the empire depended on. It survived. Somehow, improbably, it survived. Emperors like Aurelian, who reigned from 270 to 275, reunified the 3 fragments of the empire by military force and rebuilt the walls of Rome itself, which had not needed walls for centuries, into a defensive circuit that is still substantially intact. And that tells you, in stone, how much the world had changed since Augustus. Then Diocletian came to power in 284 AD and stabilized the system through a radical reorganization. He divided the empire administratively into a tetrarchy, 4 rulers governing 4 regions, with the understanding that the senior Augustuses would eventually be succeeded by their designated Caesars. He reorganized the army. He reformed the tax system. He persecuted the Christians, who by this point were numerous enough throughout the empire that persecuting them was a serious administrative undertaking. The tetrarchy did not survive Diocletian's retirement. The sons and relatives and generals of the 4 rulers immediately began fighting each other. The last man standing was Constantine, who in 312 AD defeated his rival Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge on the outskirts of Rome and became sole emperor of the Western Empire, and who attributed his victory to the Christian god whose symbol he had painted on his soldiers' shields. Whether this was genuine conversion or political calculation is a question that has been debated for 17 centuries. The effect was unambiguous. The Emperor of Rome was a Christian, and the religion that had been periodically persecuted for 3 centuries was now the religion of the man who controlled the legions. Constantine moved the capital of the empire to the east, to a new city he built on the site of the Greek town of Byzantium at the entrance to the Black Sea. He called it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The decision to move the capital reflected the same recognition that Diocletian had made. The center of gravity of the empire had shifted east, toward the wealthier provinces, the more defensible frontiers, the older and more urbanized civilizations of the Greek-speaking world. Rome, the city on the 7 hills, remained the symbolic heart of the empire. It was no longer its administrative center. The Western Empire lasted another century and a half after Constantine. It was a century and a half of slow motion. The process of what historians call the fall of the Western Empire is more complicated and more interesting than the word fall suggests. There was no single catastrophic event, no single day on which everything ended. There was a long erosion of central authority, a series of Germanic kingdoms that set up inside the empire's borders, a gradual replacement of Roman administrative structures with successor systems that were partly Roman and partly something new. The Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD. Alaric, their king, had served in the Roman army and had been denied the recognition he felt he deserved. He led his people into Italy and took the city, the first time Rome had been sacked since the Gauls in 387 BC. The sack lasted 3 days. Alaric did not burn Rome. He took what was valuable and left. But the psychological effect was enormous. The city that had ruled the world had been taken by barbarians. Augustus, sitting in North Africa, began writing The City of God to explain what it meant. The Vandals sacked Rome in 455. This sack was more thorough and lasted longer, and from it we get our word vandalism. Though the Vandals of history were considerably more interested in organized looting than random destruction. The last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a young man whose name combined the name of Rome's legendary founder with the diminutive of the name of Rome's greatest emperor, was deposed in 476 AD by a Germanic officer named Odoacer, who sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern emperor in Constantinople and did not bother to appoint a replacement. The Eastern emperor accepted the transfer with something between relief and indifference. 476 is the traditional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It is a convenient date. Like the founding date of 753 BC, it is more a marker than an event. The Roman world did not end. The Eastern Empire, which historians call Byzantium, continued for another 1,000 years and fell only in 1453 when the Ottoman Turks took Constantinople. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced Rome in the West adopted Roman law, corresponded in Latin, and thought of themselves as the heirs of Rome rather than its destroyers. The Church of Rome maintained and transmitted Roman administrative traditions across the medieval period. The Pope, the Bishop of Rome, took over many of the functions that the emperor had previously performed in the West. Rome did not fall, it transformed. What it had built was too deeply embedded in the fabric of Western civilization to disappear with any particular emperor or any particular date. There is a question that every thoughtful person asks eventually when they study Rome. How did it last so long? How did a city on 7 muddy hills in central Italy build something that endured, in one form or another, for more than 2,000 years? The answer has many parts, and none of them are simple. Part of the answer is the army, which was the most consistently professional fighting force in the ancient world, and which the Romans maintained at enormous cost, because they understood, from the Gallic sack onwards, that there was no substitute for military power. The legions were not just a military organization. They were an institution that built roads and bridges and aqueducts when they were not fighting, that served as a school for the men who passed through them, that transmitted Roman technical knowledge to every corner of the empire, and that created a class of veterans who settled in frontier areas and served as anchors for Roman civilization in places that had never had cities before. Part of the answer is the law. The Romans were obsessed with legal process in a way that sometimes frustrated their enemies and sometimes frustrated themselves. But that gave their system a stability that purely personal or military systems lacked. When the emperor changed, the law stayed. The legal framework that governed property rights, contracts, family relations, inheritance, and civic obligations was continuous across reigns and dynasties in ways that made it possible for ordinary people to plan their lives without knowing or much caring who sat on the throne. Roman law was adopted by the Germanic kingdoms, adapted into the canon law of the Church, transmitted through the medieval Italian city-states into the modern legal systems of most of Western Europe and Latin America. The legal principles that the Romans worked out between 450 BC and 300 AD are still the foundation of the legal systems under which the majority of the world's people live today. Part of the answer is the infrastructure. The Roman roads were not just roads. They were a statement about permanence, about the intention to be here indefinitely and to manage the physical landscape accordingly. Roman roads were built to last, with layers of gravel and sand and stone that created surfaces that could handle the weight of wheeled vehicles and the feet of marching soldiers and the hooves of pack animals. They went straight when they could and followed the terrain when they had to, and they connected every significant city in the empire to every other significant city in a network that had more in common with a modern highway system than with anything else the ancient world produced. Many of them are still beneath the highways of modern Europe, and in some places, the modern roads simply follow the Roman roads, because nothing that has been built in 2,000 years has improved on the alignment the Roman engineers chose. Part of the answer is the language. Latin spread across the Western Empire through the army, through administration, through commerce, and through aspiration, because to speak Latin well was to have access to the full Roman world, to the law courts and the magistracies and the merchant networks and the literary culture. Latin fragmented into the Romance languages, which today are spoken by more than 700 million people as their first language, and by hundreds of millions more as second languages. The fact that Spanish and Portuguese and French and Italian and Romanian are all descended from Latin, from the soldiers' camp Latin of the legions and the administrative Latin of the provincial courts, is a testament to the depth of the Roman penetration of the European world. And part of the answer, perhaps the deepest part, is the idea that membership in a civic community is defined by law rather than by blood, that people of different origins and different languages and different gods can be citizens of the same thing and owe the same obligations to each other and have the same rights before the courts. The Romans did not always live up to this idea. The history of Roman expansion is full of atrocity and exploitation, and the systematic use of violence to impose Roman authority on people who had not asked for it. The empire rested on slave labor in ways that should not be minimized or forgotten. The rights that Roman law guaranteed were not available to everyone equally, and the gap between the theory of citizenship and the practice of power was often vast. But the idea itself was powerful and durable in a way that the Roman army was not, in a way that the Roman roads eventually ceased to be. The idea that civic identity is a legal status rather than a hereditary one, that the law can in principle be the same for everyone, that political authority derives from something more than force alone. These ideas run directly from Rome into the traditions of Western political thought and Western law, and the Western conception of what a state is and what it owes its people. When the Republic of the United States was founded in the 18th century, its founders thought and wrote and argued in Roman terms. They read Cicero and Polybius and Livy. They named their institutions: the Senate, the Capitol, the fasces on the Speaker's podium in the House of Representatives. When the French Revolution abolished the monarchy, it reached for Roman republican symbols: the rods and axes of the lictors, the eagle of the legions. When Napoleon wanted to define his empire, he looked to Rome for the template. The emperor's title is from the Latin imperator. The word president is from the Latin praises. The word republic is from the Latin res publica, the public thing. The village on the 7 hills is still here. In the language we use for our institutions, in the law we use for our contracts, in the roads under our feet, and the pipes under our streets, Rome did not fall. Rome is the water in which the Western world still swims, so pervasive that it has become invisible, which is perhaps the most complete form of triumph available. The night is deep now. Somewhere in your room, perhaps, the light is low or gone entirely. There is something fitting about hearing the story of Rome in the dark. The Romans themselves had a complicated relationship with darkness and rest. They did not entirely trust sleep. They thought it was too close to death. They had a god for it, Somnus, and they had a goddess for dreams, and they were not sure the dreams sent by the goddess were always benevolent. The emperor Marcus Aurelius, in his meditations, reminded himself repeatedly that the night was not different from the day in what it demanded of him. To rest was permitted. To stop being what you were, even in sleep, was not. But Marcus Aurelius was writing in the 2nd century AD, when the empire was already very old, and the weight of it was pressing on him in ways he could feel in his body and see in the lines of the dispatches from the Danube frontier. He was a tired man, telling himself to keep going. There is a reason his meditations have been read for 18 centuries by people who are also tired and also trying to keep going. The story we have told tonight is not the story of perfect men or perfect institutions. The Romans were not the Romans of the marble statues, serene and proportioned and stripped of all the mess of actual life. They were quarrelsome and ambitious, and sometimes astonishingly brave, and sometimes casually cruel. They built the best road network in the ancient world, and they built it partly with slaves. They wrote some of the most beautiful prose in any human language, and they used that prose to justify things that should not be justified. They created institutions of extraordinary durability, and they broke those institutions repeatedly in service of the ambitions of men who wanted more than the institutions were designed to give them. They were, in other words, people who happened to be in the right place at the right time, with the right combination of talents and the right willingness to keep going when the ordinary calculation would have suggested stopping. That combination is not available for purchase or prescription. It appears when it appears, in villages on muddy hills, in families with good names and no money, in armies that lose catastrophically and come back anyway, in institutions that bend and crack and hold and bend again. The city on the 7 hills rose because it would not stay down. That is not an explanation, exactly. It is a description. Sometimes a description is the most honest thing available. The lights of Rome are still burning tonight, if you could see them. The Forum is lit up for the tourists who wander through it during the day, and the security lights that keep it visible at night. The Colosseum stands in its floodlit, orange gold, cracked and stripped of much of its marble, but still massive, still capable of making a person standing at its base feel appropriately small. The Pantheon still has its original roof, the great concrete dome with the oculus open to the sky, and on rainy days, the rain falls straight through the hole and drains through a channel in the floor that the Roman engineers put there 2,000 years ago. The water still drains, the dome still stands. Somewhere beneath the streets of the modern city, the old streets are still there. The Forum, which is not buried, but which has been built over and built over again, sits at a level several meters below the current street level. The foundations of the Republic are under the foundations of the Empire, are under the foundations of the medieval city, are under the foundations of the Renaissance city, are under the streets of the modern city. Rome is not built on one layer. It is built on itself, repeatedly. The new city always standing on the bones of the old. That is perhaps the truest image of what Rome was and is. Not a beginning and an ending. A continuous process of building on what came before, of inheriting and discarding and adapting and preserving, of making something new out of materials that were already old. The Romans did it literally, in their buildings. They did it institutionally, in their law. They did it linguistically, in the Latin that became the Romance languages, and the legal Latin that still marks the documents of courts around the world. The story is not over. It was never the kind of story that ends. The Tiber is still running tonight, past the ruins of the old harbour at Ostia, past the old Aurelian Wall, through the city where the 7 hills are now buried under 25 centuries of continuous habitation. The water that falls in the Apennines tonight will reach the sea tomorrow, the same water that fell on the Palatine Hill in the 8th century BC, when the shepherds were first looking down at the marshy valley and thinking about whether it was worth trying to drain it. They decided it was. Everything else followed from that. Sleep well. Wherever you are tonight, and whatever hour it is there, the city on the 7 hills is still standing. It has been standing longer than almost anything else built by human hands. It will probably outlast the questions we have about it. That is a comfortable thing to fall asleep knowing. Good night. The soil of Italy was not an accident. Before we leave the story of Rome's rise completely, there is something that deserves more time than the broad sweep of political and military history usually gives it. The land itself, and what it meant to the people who lived on it, and how the Romans' relationship to the soil shaped everything about the civilization they built. Central Italy is not the most dramatic landscape in the Mediterranean world. It does not have the jagged peaks of Greece, or the vast desert horizons of North Africa, or the immense river plains of Mesopotamia. What it has is something quieter and more productive. A series of river valleys with deep, fertile soils of volcanic origin, a climate of moderate rainfall and warm summers, hillsides that drain well and catch enough sun for olive trees and vines, and a coastline that is long enough to give access to the sea without being so intricate and island-studded as to make maritime orientation the dominant economic fact of life. The Romans were farmers before they were soldiers and before they were lawyers. The earliest Roman calendar, which the tradition attributes to Romulus, was organized around agricultural rhythms, the planting seasons and the harvest seasons, and the periods between when the land rested. The Roman year originally had only 10 months and began in March, when the agricultural season began and when the campaigning season began, and it did not include the winter months at all, because nothing interesting happened in the winter months from the perspective of a farming community in central Italy. January and February were added later, which is why September, October, November, and December are named for the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th months, even though they are actually the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th months of the year as we use it. The counting was done before the winter months were added. This agricultural foundation gave Roman life a particular texture. The ideal Roman was not the urban philosopher of Greek imagination or the wandering merchant of Phoenician imagination. The ideal Roman was the farmer-soldier, a man who owned enough land to be self-sufficient, who could put on his armor when the city needed him and return to his farm when the fighting was done, who maintained his property with his own hands and the hands of his family, who knew the names of his gods because he had seen what happened to his crops when the rains were wrong and had understood that there were forces larger than himself at work in the world. This ideal was never entirely real. Rome had a commercial economy from very early on, a class of wealthy landowners who did not farm their land personally but managed it through slaves and tenants, a class of urban poor who had no land at all. But the ideal persisted and shaped Roman thinking about what a proper life looked like for several centuries. The agricultural writers, men like Cato the Elder and Varro and Columella, wrote treatises on farming that were not merely technical manuals, but arguments about how life should be lived, with attention to the land, with respect for tradition, with the understanding that what you put into the earth is what you get back from it, a principle that applied to civic life as well. Cato the Elder, who lived from 234 to 149 BC, and who was one of the most influential figures of the Middle Republic, is a good example of the type in its most vigorous and most intimidating form. He was a farmer's son from Tusculum, who rose through military service and political office to become censor in 184 BC, which put him in charge of public morality and the public accounts. He used the office aggressively, removing several senators he deemed insufficiently Roman in their habits, which included being too fond of Greek luxury, too extravagant in their personal spending, too willing to adopt foreign customs. He was famously hostile to Greece and to everything Greek, which creates a certain irony, given that he is also one of the Romans who most thoroughly demonstrated Greek influence in his actual writing style and intellectual interests. But Cato, the Elder's most famous statement is this. He ended every speech in the Senate, regardless of the topic under discussion, with the words, "Carthago delenda est." Carthage must be destroyed. He said this for years, through the long period between the Second and Third Punic Wars, until the Senate finally agreed and Rome fought the Third Punic War and destroyed Carthage. Whether this was strategic calculation, personal obsession, or the particular single-mindedness of an old man who had lived through the Second Punic War and never stopped being afraid of what Carthage might become again, is a question the sources do not resolve. Probably some of all three. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BC was one of those events that haunted the Roman imagination long after the fact, and not only because of what was done to Carthage. The Romans who reflected on it recognized that the destruction of their greatest rival had removed the external pressure that had, in some sense, kept the Republic honest. While Carthage existed, the Republic needed to function, needed to maintain the solidarity between its social classes that made military mobilization possible, needed to manage the tensions between patricians and plebeians without letting them explode into open violence. With Carthage gone, the constraints were off. The Gracchi, who came 20 years after the destruction of Carthage, were not a coincidence. The social tensions that the Republic had managed under pressure erupted when the pressure was removed. This is one of those patterns that historians see repeatedly across different civilizations. The external threat that holds a society together, and the internal fractures that become visible when the threat is gone. The Romans saw it too. Sallust wrote about it explicitly in the 1st century BC, arguing that the decline of Roman morality dated from the destruction of Carthage. Whether he was right in the causal argument, the observation that something changed after 146 BC is supported by the evidence. The Roman relationship with religion was unlike anything that a monotheist, looking back from a later perspective, might expect. There was no single Roman religion, no creed, no orthodoxy, no institution that defined what a Roman must believe in the way that a church or a mosque or a synagogue might define the beliefs of its members. What there was, instead, was a vast and proliferating system of ritual obligation, of proper forms for approaching the gods, of specific prayers and specific sacrifices and specific festivals tied to specific gods and specific moments in the agricultural and civic calendar. The Roman gods were, in origin, the gods of the local Latin landscape, spirits of the fields and the boundaries and the hearth, forces that inhabited specific places and had specific claims on specific forms of attention. Jupiter was the sky, the thunder, the great oath-keeper whose name was invoked in treaties because to break an oath sworn in his name was to invite his direct intervention. Juno was the protector of women, particularly women in the vulnerable moments of marriage and childbirth. Mars was the father of Romulus, the god of the agricultural boundary and then, increasingly, the god of war. Minerva was the goddess of craft and wisdom, of the skilled hand and the intelligent mind. Janus was the god of beginnings and transitions, of doors and gates and the passage between one state and another, which is why his name is still attached to the first month of the year in most of the world. The Romans added to this local roster constantly, absorbing the gods of the peoples they conquered and the peoples they traded with. They identified their own gods with Greek gods, Jupiter with Zeus, Juno with Hera, Mars with Ares, Minerva with Athena, Venus with Aphrodite. This process of identification was not always philosophically satisfying, because the Greek gods had personalities and mythological biographies that the Roman gods sometimes did not quite match, but it allowed the Romans to participate in the rich mythological tradition of Greece without entirely abandoning their own tradition. The result was the Greco-Roman mythology that most people today think of simply as classical mythology, the stories of Olympus and the heroes, and the great wars of gods and mortals. But the Roman attitude toward religion was fundamentally practical, in a way that the Greek philosophical tradition found somewhat shallow, and that modern religious sensibilities might find puzzling. The Romans did not, in general, ask whether Jupiter existed, or what Jupiter was like as a personality, or whether Jupiter had good intentions toward the world. They asked what Jupiter required and whether they had done it properly. Religion was, in Roman terms, a series of transactions between the human world and the divine world. Transactions that had to be conducted correctly, with the proper forms and the proper attention, if they were to achieve their purpose. This is why the Romans had augurs, priests, whose specific function was to read the will of the gods through signs, particularly the behavior of birds. Before any major military action, any significant public decision, any important ceremony, the augurs were consulted. They watched the sky. They observed what birds flew from what direction, in what numbers, and in what pattern. They reported their findings. The action was taken, or not taken, based on what the signs indicated. The Romans were perfectly capable of ignoring bad omens when they were inconvenient, and there are several famous stories in the tradition of Roman commanders dismissing unfavorable augury before battles that went on to be disasters, with the tradition understanding this as the proper punishment for impiety. But the institution itself was maintained with total seriousness, because the Romans understood that the relationship between the human world and the divine world was real and had to be managed, and that managing it required experts. This practical religiosity had an interesting effect on Roman attitudes toward foreign religions. In general, the Romans were tolerant of the religions of the peoples they conquered for two reasons. First, they were not sure they knew all the gods. and incorporating the gods of a conquered people was a way of making sure those gods were on your side rather than against you. Second, local religious practices were part of the local social fabric, and disrupting them was disruptive of social order, which the Romans cared about more than theological uniformity. The exceptions are instructive. The Druids of Gaul and Britain were suppressed, not because of their religious beliefs as such, but because they were the intellectual and political leadership of the Celtic peoples, the class that maintained traditions and organized resistance, and suppressing them was a strategy for breaking the coherence of the communities that resisted Roman authority. The Christians were persecuted, periodically and locally, and never with systematic total commitment until Diocletian's reign, because they refused to participate in the public religious ceremonies that the Romans regarded as civic obligation. They would not sacrifice to the imperial genius, which was less about believing the emperor was a god than about performing the ritual of loyalty that sacrifice represented. In the Roman view, refusing to sacrifice was not a private spiritual choice, but a public political statement about loyalty, and it was treated as such. The Jews were a special case, the religion of a people who had a distinctive monotheism and a long tradition of resisting assimilation. Rome was generally tolerant of Jewish practice, as long as Jews paid their taxes and did not resist Roman authority militarily. When they did resist militarily, as in the revolt of 66 to 73 AD and the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 AD, the Roman response was devastating. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, carried out by the future emperor Titus, ended the temple-based form of Judaism and produced the dispersal of the Jewish population that would shape the history of the next 2,000 years. The physical city of Rome is its own kind of document, and it is worth spending some time inside it. The Forum, which began as a marshy, low area between the Palatine and Capitoline hills that was drained and paved over the course of the royal period and the early republic, was the center of everything. Not a grand planned space, at least not in its origins, but a crowded accumulation of temples and basilicas and market stalls and rostra, the speaker's platform decorated with the iron rams taken from enemy ships, and statues. So many statues that the emperors periodically had to clear some of them away to make room for others. The Forum was where law cases were argued, and political speeches were delivered, and public executions were carried out, and business was transacted, and people met each other, and gossip was exchanged, and news was posted on the walls. It was simultaneously a courthouse and a marketplace, and a public square and a sacred precinct, which is a combination that is difficult to imagine in a modern context, because we have carefully separated these functions into different buildings in different locations. The Roman house, if you were wealthy enough to have a proper one, was organized around the atrium, an open central space with a hole in the roof to let in light and a shallow pool in the floor to catch rainwater. From the atrium, rooms opened in all directions: bedrooms, the study where the head of the household received clients in the morning, the dining room where the family ate, and where formal dinner parties were held. Behind the main rooms was the garden, the hortus, which in the earliest period was a kitchen garden growing vegetables and herbs for the household's use, and which in the great houses of the late Republic and the Empire became elaborate pleasure gardens with fountains and statues, topiary and the fragrance of roses and lavender. The Roman dinner party, the convivium, was one of the most important social institutions of the educated Roman class. You arrived, you reclined on couches arranged around a low table because the Romans did not, for formal dining, sit in chairs. You were served multiple courses, the first of which was meant to stimulate appetite, and the last of which was meant to conclude the meal on a sweet note. You drank wine, mixed with water in proportions that varied with the occasion, served by slaves, and you talked. The talking was the point. The food was important, but the conversation was more important. And the best dinner parties produced the kind of talk that people remembered and sometimes wrote down afterward. Many of the works of Roman philosophical and intellectual culture were written as dialogues set at dinner parties, because the dinner party was where educated Romans expected to encounter ideas. Cicero set many of his philosophical dialogues at dinner parties or country house gatherings of the kind that followed the same social conventions. Pliny the Younger describes in his letters the dinner parties of the wealthy Trajanic era with a slightly pained undertone that suggests he sometimes found them more obligatory than pleasurable, but attended them because they were where things happened. The Roman bath, the thermae, was something else entirely. If the dinner party was where the educated class talked, the bath was where everyone else talked, and where the educated class also talked, because the bath was one of the genuinely shared institutions of Roman civic life. The great imperial baths, the thermae of Caracalla and of Diocletian, were not simply places to get clean. They were enormous civic complexes, with warm rooms and hot rooms, and cold pools and exercise courtyards, and libraries and gardens and shops. You could spend an entire day at the baths without running out of things to do. The admission price was low, often just a quadrans. The smallest Roman coin, the poorest Roman citizen, and the wealthiest senator used the same facility, which created a kind of social leveling that had few parallels in the ancient world. The aqueducts that fed the baths, and the public fountains that served the people who had no private water connection, were Rome's most spectacular engineering achievements. The Aqua Appia, built in 312 BC, was the first of 11 aqueducts that eventually served the city of Rome. By the 2nd century AD, Rome had more fresh water per capita than most modern European cities. The water was not just for drinking and bathing. It fed the fountains at every street corner where people gathered to fill their jugs and exchange news. It ran through the channels of the public latrines, where Romans sat side by side without the privacy that modern people expect, and talked while they attended to their bodily needs. Because Romans did not have the same sense that bodily functions were private events. The Colosseum, which was officially called the Flavian Amphitheatre, and was built between 70 and 80 AD on the site of the artificial lake in the grounds of Nero's enormous Golden House, held between 50 and 80,000 spectators, depending on which calculation you accept. The games held there, the gladiatorial combats and the beast hunts and the public executions dressed up as mythology, were not primarily about entertainment in the simple sense. They were the largest public ritual of the imperial state, the occasion when the emperor sat in his special box and demonstrated his generosity by providing spectacle, and when the people had the rare opportunity to make their feelings known to the most powerful man in the world by their reactions to what they saw. A gladiator who fought well and bravely had a claim on the crowd's mercy. If the crowd showed mercy by waving their handkerchiefs or thumbing upward, the emperor generally responded to that signal, because to ignore the crowd's wishes was to court unpopularity of the most immediate kind. The games were a conversation, in their way, between the ruler and the ruled, conducted through the medium of controlled violence. It was not a conversation that we would find admirable or that we should romanticize, but it was real, and it tells you something about the relationship between Roman rulers and the Roman public that it was conducted in this form. The Roman army deserves its own extended attention, because it is impossible to understand Rome without understanding what the Roman army was and how it worked, and what it meant to the men who served in it. The early Roman army was a militia of property-owning citizens who provided their own equipment. The scale of property you owned determined what kind of equipment you were expected to provide, and therefore what position you occupied in the battle line. The wealthiest citizens were cavalry, because they could afford horses. The next group were the heavy infantry, who could afford bronze armor. Then came successive grades of lighter-armed men, down to those who could only afford to fight with a sling or nothing at all. This property-based army was functional for the limited wars of the early Republic, fought largely against Rome's immediate neighbors in central Italy, and largely in single campaigning seasons. The Hannibalic War changed everything. Years of continuous campaigning against a mobile enemy in multiple theaters of operation required an army that could operate independently of the agricultural calendar, and that could be kept in the field year-round if necessary. It required standardization of equipment, so that replacement and resupply were possible. It required a level of professionalism that a militia of farmers going home after the harvest could not maintain. What emerged was not an overnight transformation, but a gradual evolution. By the time of the great commanders of the late Republic, Sulla and Pompey and Caesar and Crassus, the legions had become something close to professional armies. The soldiers served for multiple years, often more than a decade. They were trained continuously, not just before a specific campaign. They built their own camps when they stopped for the night. Organized camps with a specific layout, repeated every time, so that a soldier waking in the night knew where everything was without having to think about it. They carried more equipment than their earlier counterparts. Tools for building fortifications and digging trenches, because Roman armies routinely built extensive field fortifications, even for single-night camps, as well as their weapons and personal equipment. The legionaries' basic weapons were the pilum, a heavy javelin about 2 meters long with an iron shank designed to bend on impact so that it could not be thrown back, and the gladius, a short stabbing sword of Spanish origin that the Romans adopted and adapted and used with devastating effect in the close quarters fighting that their tactics were designed to produce. The standard Roman tactical approach was to advance to javelin range, throw the pila, and then close immediately with the sword before the enemy had time to recover. It required discipline to execute and nerve to sustain. But when it worked spectacularly. The legions of the imperial period were a further evolution. Gaius Marius, the general and politician who reformed the army in the late 2nd century BC, had opened service to men without property, creating for the first time a truly volunteer professional army, and had required the army to provide the equipment rather than the individual soldier. This made the army more flexible, more democratic in its social composition, and more dependent on its commander for the pay and the land grant at retirement that were its reward for service. The army's loyalty, which in the Republic had been primarily to Rome as a collective entity, shifted subtly toward the commander who controlled the pay. This is the structural change that made the civil wars of the late Republic possible. Caesar's legions were loyal to Caesar, not to the abstraction of the Roman Republic. Augustus addressed this problem by making the emperor the ultimate source of military patronage. The pay, the retirement bonus, the land grants all came from the emperor's personal treasury and were distributed in the emperor's name. The army's loyalty to the emperor was built into the financial architecture of the imperial system. It worked for as long as the emperor could pay. When the financial system broke down, as it did in the 3rd century, the army's loyalty dissolved into loyalty to whoever could promise most immediately to make good on the money. The Roman army also built. This is a point that deserves more emphasis than it usually gets. The legions were not simply fighting machines. They were engineering organizations of the first order, capable of constructing roads, bridges, fortifications, harbors, aqueducts, and entire cities when they were not engaged in combat. The construction work was not a sideline. It was integral to Roman military strategy. A Roman army could establish a fortified camp in a matter of hours. It could bridge a river in days. It could build a road through difficult terrain at a rate that modern construction crews, without the benefit of heavy machinery, would find difficult to match. The roads that connected the empire, the aqueducts that supplied its cities, the walls that defended its frontiers, were all largely the work of the legions, built when the fighting was done and the men needed something to do. The soldiers themselves were a remarkable cross-section of the Mediterranean world, particularly in the imperial period. In the early Republic, service in the legions was restricted to Roman citizens. As citizenship was extended, first to the Italian allies after the Social War, and then, through various means, to provincial populations, the legions drew from a wider and wider pool. By the 2nd century AD, a legion stationed in Syria or Britain might have soldiers from Gaul and Spain and North Africa and the Balkans and Asia Minor, all speaking Latin as their military language, all carrying the Roman eagle, all organized according to the same tactical manuals and building their camps according to the same specifications. The legion was not just a military unit, it was a cultural institution that transmitted Roman civilization into the bodies and habits of men from every corner of the empire. The Roman roads are perhaps the most lasting physical legacy of the civilization, and they deserve a meditation of their own. The Via Appia, the Queen of Roads, as the Romans called it, was begun in 312 BC under the censorship of Appius Claudius Caecus, whose name it carries. It ran from Rome south to Capua, the major city of Campania, a distance of about 200 kilometers, and was later extended south and east to Brindisi on the Adriatic coast, the main embarkation point for ships to Greece and the East. It was not the first Roman road, but it was the first of the major long-distance road-building projects that would eventually cover the empire with a network of around 80,000 kilometers of paved roads. Roman road construction was precise and methodical. The surveyors used a device called a groma to establish straight alignments, which is why Roman roads are famously straight. They ran in straight lines between calculated points, deviating only when the terrain made the straight line genuinely impassable. The road was then dug down to firm subsoil and built back up in layers: a base of large stones, then a layer of smaller stones and rubble, then a layer of gravel, then the surface stones, which were carefully fitted together to create a durable, well-draining surface that could handle heavy traffic in all weather conditions. The surface stones were, in many cases, large polygonal blocks of basalt or local stone, fitted so precisely that they remain in place 2,000 years later in the sections of the Via Appia that have not been covered or rebuilt. You can walk on Roman road surface today in several places in Italy and feel under your feet the same stones that Roman legionaries marched on, and Roman merchants drove their carts over, and Roman messengers galloped their horses along. There is a particular kind of historical communion available in that contact that no museum exhibit quite replicates. The roads were maintained by a system of stations and mansiones, official stopping places at intervals of about 30 to 40 kilometers, which was roughly a day's march. These stations provided fresh horses for the imperial messenger service, the cursus publicus, which was not available to ordinary travelers, but which allowed the emperor in Rome to receive messages from the frontiers in a matter of days that would have taken weeks without the road system and the organized relay. The cursus publicus was, in effect, the Roman postal and communication system, and it was fast by the standards of any pre-electric civilization. A letter sent from Rome to Alexandria took roughly 2 weeks in good sailing weather. A message sent by the imperial relay from Rome to Cologne might take a week. These times were not reliably reproducible because the weather intervened and the roads flooded in winter and the horses had bad days. But the infrastructure existed for the communication to happen at all, which was itself extraordinary. The roads also carried trade. Roman merchants moved goods across the empire on a scale that had no parallel in the ancient world. Amphorae of Spanish olive oil were found in Britain. Indian pepper arrived in Rome. Baltic amber ended up in North Africa. Egyptian papyrus was used by accountants in London. The scale of this trade is visible in the archaeological record, in the distribution of pottery types and wine amphorae and glass vessels that show up in excavations from one end of the empire to the other, following the roads and the sea lanes that the roads connected. The fate of the ordinary person in the Roman world is harder to recover than the fate of the generals and the emperors, because ordinary people did not usually have statues made of them or write books about themselves. But archaeology has been recovering their world gradually, and what it shows is a civilization that was, for most of its extent and most of its history, considerably more complex and considerably more comfortable than the word ancient suggests to modern ears. The carbonized loaves of bread found in the bakeries of Pompeii, preserved exactly as they were when the ash fell in 79 AD, tell you that Roman bakers made bread in specific sizes and shapes. The graffiti on the walls of Pompeii, which cover virtually every available surface, tell you that Roman people were literate enough to write on walls for pleasure, and that what they wrote ranged from political endorsements to declarations of love, to complaints about a neighbor, and to obscene jokes of a kind that would not embarrass a modern stand-up comedian. The surgical instruments found in the excavations of Roman sites across the empire tell you that Roman medicine, while not equipped with anything we would recognize as modern pharmaceutical tools, was performed with precision instruments made to close tolerances and used with enough success that surgery was apparently irregular rather than a desperate option. The papyri from Roman Egypt, which have survived in the dry climate of the desert in quantities that give us a remarkably detailed picture of Roman provincial life at every level, tell you that ordinary Romans wrote to their mothers, complained about their employers, contracted for construction work in language of extraordinary specificity, filed legal complaints about neighbors who encroached on their property, and worried about money and weather and the health of their children in terms that are not difficult to translate into modern emotional register. They were not very different from us, which is either comforting or unsettling depending on your perspective. The slaves, whose labor underlaid everything, are the hardest to recover as individuals and the easiest to lose in the aggregate. Roman slavery was not race-based. The slaves in the Roman world were people of every background who had been captured in war or born to enslaved mothers or sold into slavery to settle debt. The scale of slavery in the Roman world was enormous. Estimates vary, but scholars suggest that Italy in the late Republic may have had a slave population as high as 2 to 3 million, in a total population of 6 to 7 million. The lives of those slaves varied enormously depending on what work they were required to do and who owned them. A slave who worked in the silver mines at Cartagena in Spain lived a short and brutal life in darkness and physical degradation. A slave who served as a tutor or a secretary in a wealthy household in Rome lived in circumstances that were constrained and humiliating in their own ways, but that were materially not worse than those of many free poor people. The moral horror of slavery, which the Romans were aware of on some level, even without the full vocabulary that later centuries would develop, did not translate into its abolition because it was too economically central and too socially embedded to be removed without something approaching a revolution. The freed slaves, the liberti, are one of the more interesting social phenomena of Roman civilization. Freedom, when it came, did not bring full equality. A freed slave remained in a relationship of obligation to his or her former owner, owed them certain services and deference, and carried the stigma of former slavery for the rest of their lives. But their children were free Roman citizens with no such stigma. This created a powerful demographic dynamic. The freed slave class was highly motivated, often skilled, often capable, and driven by the awareness that their social position was temporary in the most literal sense. What they could not achieve in their own lifetime, their children might. This produced a class of entrepreneurs and craftsmen and traders who were among the most economically dynamic elements of Roman society, who built businesses and left money and established their families in ways that their children would use to enter the property-owning middle class. The Trimalchio of Petronius's Satyricon, the enormously wealthy, vulgarly ostentatious freed slave who throws a dinner party that takes up the central section of the novel, is a satirical character meant to be ridiculous, but he is also evidence that such figures existed in sufficient number and with sufficient social prominence that the satirical type was recognizable. The Romans who laughed at Trimalchio knew men like him. Many of them probably owed men like him money. The literature that the Romans left is one of the great deposits of the human mind. Latin literature begins, in the forms we can recover, with Plautus and Terence, comic playwrights of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, who adapted Greek New Comedy for Roman audiences, and in doing so, created the template for the comedy of manners that has produced everything from Molière to Oscar Wilde. The Roman audience laughed at the same stock characters that made the Athenian audience laugh. The clever slave who outwits the stuffy father, the young man in love with an unsuitable girl, the soldier who boasts of his non-existent military exploits, the miserly old man who hoards money his children want to spend. These types are still recognizable. Lucretius, writing in the 1st century BC, produced one of the most extraordinary poems in any language, the De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, a philosophical exposition of Epicurean atomism in hexameter verse. Lucretius believed that the universe was composed of atoms, that the gods did not intervene in human affairs, that death was simply the dissolution of the atoms that compose a person and was therefore nothing to fear, and that the good life was one of simple pleasure and the contemplation of the natural world. He expressed these beliefs in verse of such beauty that even people who find the philosophy unconvincing find themselves moved by the poem. The opening invocation to Venus, which asks the goddess to fill the world with the impulse toward life and creation, is one of the most beautiful passages in Latin literature, and it was written by a man who did not believe that Venus could hear him. Cicero, who was born in 106 BC and killed on the orders of Mark Antony in 43 BC, was the most prolific and the most influential of all Roman writers. His letters alone, of which more than 800 survive, give us an inside view of the late Republic, more detailed and more intimate than any other source. His speeches, 60 of which survive in whole or substantial part, are the finest examples of Latin oratory and were used as models for Latin style for 15 centuries after his death. His philosophical works, which he wrote in a frenzy of activity during a period when political circumstances had temporarily sidelined him, introduced Greek philosophy to the Latin world in Latin prose of extraordinary clarity. His legal and political writings shaped the theory of natural law and the idea of a universal human community governed by reason that runs through Stoicism, into Christianity, into the Enlightenment, into the American Declaration of Independence. Cicero was killed because he had made too many powerful enemies, and because, in the civil war that followed Caesar's assassination, he had bet on the wrong side and run out of options. His head and his hands were cut off and displayed on the speaker's platform in the Forum, at the place from which he had addressed the Roman people so many times. Mark Antony's wife Fulvia reportedly pulled out his tongue and stabbed it with a hairpin. The story may not be true. The fact that it was told and believed tells you something about the emotions that Cicero inspired in the people who hated him. Virgil, who was born in 70 BC and died in 19 BC, wrote the Aeneid, which was the Roman national epic, the story of Aeneas, the Trojan prince who survived the fall of Troy and, after many wanderings, came to Italy and became the ancestor of the Romans. Augustus commissioned the poem, or at least strongly encouraged it, because it provided a mythological foundation for Rome's connection to Troy and for Augustus's own dynasty's connection to Venus through Aeneas. Virgil worked on the poem for the last decade of his life and died before he considered it finished. He asked on his deathbed that the manuscript be burned, and Augustus refused to allow it. Whether Virgil's dissatisfaction was aesthetic or political or both is a question that scholars have never stopped arguing about. The Aeneid is a magnificent and deeply melancholy poem. Its famous first words, Arma virumque cano, I sing of arms and the man, echo Homer's openings in the Iliad and the Odyssey, but the Aeneid is not Homeric in its emotional register. Homer's heroes are exuberant. Achilles rages, and his rage is the rage of a man who feels everything with enormous intensity, including his own excellence. Aeneas, the Roman hero, cannot afford to feel that way. He is burdened by duty. He is burdened by the knowledge that the future of his people depends on what he does and does not do. He loves Dido, the queen of Carthage, who receives him when his fleet is wrecked on her coast, and he must leave her because the gods have told him to go to Italy and found the line that will produce Rome. Dido kills herself when he leaves. Aeneas sails away, knowing what his departure has done, and doing it anyway. The founding of Rome, in Virgil's telling, required the sacrifice of people who deserved better. That is not a comforting myth. It is an honest one. Horace, Ovid, Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius, Juvenal, Martial, Seneca, Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger, Marcus Aurelius. The list of major Roman writers whose works survive in substantial form is long enough that a person could spend a lifetime reading only Romans and not exhaust the material. Each of them gives you a different angle on the Roman world. Tacitus is savage about the emperors and clear-eyed about what the Principate cost the Roman aristocracy. Juvenal is furious about the corruption and vulgarity of Roman urban life in the 2nd century and funny about it at the same time. Pliny the Younger is polished and sociable and self-conscious, always aware that his letters might be published and writing them accordingly. Suetonius is the gossip who collected every scandalous story about the Julio-Claudian emperors and organized them thematically with the organizational zeal of a librarian, which he partly was. Reading the Romans is a particular kind of experience. The world they describe is familiar enough that you feel at home in it, and foreign enough that you are constantly surprised. They had no anesthesia, and no antibiotics, and no understanding of how disease was transmitted, but they had heated baths, and underfloor heating, and running water, and organized postal services, and sophisticated legal systems, and satirical poetry of great wit. They were cruel in ways we find difficult to comprehend, and humane in ways we do not always expect. They were us, arranged differently. The question of what Rome means is one that every generation that has encountered Rome has had to answer for itself. For the medieval world, Rome was primarily the church. The succession of the popes from Peter, the architecture of the basilica that became the plan for Christian churches, the Latin language of the liturgy, the legal framework of canon law. For the Renaissance, Rome was the classical aesthetic, the proportions of the column, the idealization of the human body in marble, the literary standards of Cicero and Virgil, against which all subsequent writing in Latin and eventually in the vernacular languages was measured. For the Enlightenment, Rome was the Republic, the civic virtue of the senators, the idea that a state could be governed by law rather than by the arbitrary will of a king, the examples of men who chose the public interest over their personal safety and were celebrated for it. For the Age of Revolution, Rome was both a model and a warning. The American founders, who named their upper legislative chamber the Senate and their hill the Capitol, were invoking the Republic. Napoleon, who put himself on a throne and gave himself the title of Emperor and put the eagle of the legions on his standard, was invoking the Empire. Both were drawing from the same well, because Rome contains both things, the Republic of civic virtue and the Empire of concentrated power, and the story of how one became the other. For our own time, Rome is perhaps most useful as a case study in the complexity of civilization, the way a city or a state can produce extraordinary things and do terrible things and sustain contradictions for centuries before they become fatal. The Romans built aqueducts and held gladiatorial combats. They produced Cicero and they produced Caligula. They extended citizenship gradually to the entire Mediterranean world, and they built that world partly on the labor of millions of enslaved people. They created institutions of extraordinary durability, and they destroyed those institutions in pursuit of individual ambition. They were, in ways that are both comforting and disturbing, extremely familiar. Perhaps that is the final thing to say. Rome is not a mirror that shows us an ideal we should aspire to, or a warning about a path we should avoid. It is something more uncomfortable, a reflection. It shows us what human beings do when they have enough power and enough time, which is to say, both better and worse than they intended, in more lasting ways than they anticipated, with consequences they did not foresee and could not control. The village on the 7 hills that started arguing about water rights and whose goats had the right to graze where did not know it was going to run the world. That is probably the most Roman thing about it. The empire was not planned. It grew the way things grow when the conditions are right and the organism is sufficiently adaptable. The conditions were right, the organism was adaptable, and a village of shepherds on 7 muddy hills above a river in central Italy turned into the largest and most durable political entity the Western world has ever produced. That is the story. It is, in the end, a story about what is possible when a group of people decides to keep going regardless of what the situation suggests they should do. The Romans lost to the Gauls and rebuilt. They lost 3 of the most devastating battles in ancient history and kept fighting. They fought a century of civil wars and came out the other side with a system that gave the Mediterranean world 200 years of comparative peace. They converted from paganism to Christianity without ceasing to be Roman. They produced emperors who were monstrous and emperors who were wise and everything in between, and the system survived most of it. What finally ended the Western Empire was not any single catastrophe, but the accumulated weight of too many problems arriving simultaneously and an institutional capacity to respond that had been eroded over too long a period. Even then, the Eastern Empire lasted another 1,000 years. Even then, the legal and linguistic and religious inheritance of Rome continued in the kingdoms that called themselves Rome's successors. You do not end Rome by defeating it, you incorporate it. That is the only way to deal with something that has become, over 8 centuries, part of the structure of the world. The river runs on, the hills are still there, the dome still stands. Good night. There is one last thing worth sitting with before sleep comes completely. We have spent this entire night moving quickly, as histories must, through centuries, that each contained more lives than can be counted and more events than can be catalogued. We have passed over the names of ordinary people who built the roads and farmed the soil and fought in the legions and managed the bakeries and raised children who would also serve the empire without being asked whether they wanted to. We have spent more time with the famous than the anonymous, because history is unfortunately organized that way by default, because the famous left more traces. But the anonymous built Rome as much as the famous did. The centurion, whose name does not appear in any surviving document, who drilled his century of 80 men every day in the rain somewhere on the Rhine frontier and kept them from deserting and got them home at the end of their 25 years and then retired to his small farm and his veterans' stipend, and probably did not think of himself as part of anything particularly historical, was as essential to the Roman project as Trajan or Hadrian or Augustus. The woman in the bakery in Pompeii, who shaped bread loaves every morning before the sun was fully up, whose name was not important enough to be recorded, and who would have found the idea of being discussed 2,000 years later both flattering and bizarre, was living the daily life that the empire made possible, and the empire existed to make that daily life possible. Or at least, that was its justification to itself. The aqueduct that brought water to her city was built by engineers and soldiers and contractors and slaves whose names are not in the history books. The road that brought the grain to the city was maintained by people we will never know. The law that protected her property rights, modest as they were, was administered by magistrates, some of whose names survive and most of whose do not. History is the story of the people we can see. The people we cannot see are always the larger part of the story. When you fall asleep tonight, you are probably lying on something softer than a Roman would have slept on, in a room that is probably better heated and better lit. But you are also a person in the middle of a story that started long before you and will continue long after, a person embedded in institutions and languages and legal frameworks that have roots going back further than you can easily trace. The word you use for a calendar comes from a Roman word. The word you use for a month comes from the Roman god mensis. The word for a second is from the Latin secunda, a second division of the hour. The civil law of many of the countries in the world today traces its lineage through medieval canon law and Renaissance legal scholarship directly back to the Corpus Juris Civilis, the compilation of Roman law that the Byzantine Emperor Justinian ordered in the 6th century AD, which was itself a compilation and systematization of centuries of Roman legal reasoning. You are, in ways you do not usually notice, still living in Rome. That is not a cause for either pride or alarm. It is simply the way things accumulate. The past is not past, the writer William Faulkner observed. It is not even past. He was talking about the American South, but the observation applies everywhere and at every scale. The present is always built on the past, layer by layer, the way Rome is built on itself, the way the city of the 21st century stands on the foundations of the medieval city, which stands on the foundations of the imperial city, which stands on the drained marshland of the Forum, where the early Romans stood and looked at each other and decided to build something. They built it. It is still here. Sleep well. There is something in the human mind that responds to the very long view. Most of our days are spent in the immediate. The thing that needs to be done today, the problem that arrived this morning, the conversation that is happening right now. The past, when we think about it at all, is usually the recent past, the last few years, the last decade, the span of living memory. We are not naturally inclined to hold 8 centuries in our minds at once. But when we do, something shifts. The scale of what human beings have built becomes visible in a way that it is not when we are standing inside it. From inside, the structures of civilization look like furniture. They are just there, solid and given the context in which life happens. From a distance, you can see that they were built, that they required effort and ingenuity and luck and time, that they could have been otherwise, that other peoples, in other times, built different structures that also lasted for a while and then gave way to something new. Rome lasted longer than almost anything. It did not last forever, and what it built outlasted even itself, in the roads and the languages and the laws and the habits of mind that still shape the world you live in. The night is quiet now. The story is told, at least as much of it as fits into a single long evening. But for tonight, this is where we stop. With the city on the 7 hills, still standing in the dark, older than almost everything around it, patient as old stone, waiting for the next morning. Good night.